Hold on a second. The camera just disconnected. Welcome to the 7-step reset. Crushing anxiety, stopping the spiral before it starts. Today we're talking about neuroplasticity, part 2. Yesterday I covered neuroplasticity, and I'll finish it up tomorrow. So it's 2 in a series of 3. Just quick refresher, I'm using the 7-step reset, which is I designed it for transformation work. But it works with anxiety as well, crushing anxiety, stopping anxiety, because anxiety, and we're not talking about mental health, but anxiety in this context, whether it's business or going after goals or what have you, it follows the same pattern, a similar pattern as habits. And at the macro level versus the micro level, since everything is atoms, it's all very fractal. So we can see similarities at the micro level and the macro level. And we'll do that today. I'll expand and contract so we could make some of the points that are important here. Now, the 7-step reset, as I said, I created it for transformation, and it supports the 7 performance areas, which is my framework for the 90-day transformation. So the 7 performance areas: mental, physical, spiritual, emotional, relationships, professional, and financial. These are the 7 areas that I use to walk through to help a person shift their identity so that it's aligned with their quest or their life design or their purpose, whatever it is. I always want to start with purpose, or at least a proxy for purpose, and a life design or a major quest is a great proxy. I need something that's bigger than they are, because it's not easy to shift your identity, and we need something that's strong enough to overcome those gaps or the limitations. So the left side is mental, physical, spiritual. This is where what we can control. We control the left side. Emotional is in our control as well, but because it can be hijacked, because people can be emotionally triggered so easily, especially in a state of fight or flight or nearing fight or flight, I put it in the middle and say that emotional is the gateway to the right side. Because if we get hijacked, we could do everything right over here, but if we get hijacked, we lose it all over here. I say you build trust like going up an escalator, but you can lose it like jumping out the window as far as speed is concerned. And then relationship, professional, and financial. Once you're over here doing this, then you follow principles. See, over here, we have to recreate our identity. Over here, we're following principles. And that's an important point because most of the work in the 90-day transformation is over here. And then what we do on the relationship, professional, and financial side is as we push on it, we find new weak links and we just work those weak links. This is not about turning weaknesses into strengths. It's about, hold on a second. It's not about turning weaknesses into strengths. It's making sure our weaknesses aren't holding us back, to making sure that they're at least at a baseline where we can move forward. So that's the seven performance areas. And then the other part of this is that, as I said, it's fractal. So as we're transforming ourselves, the biggest obstacle to habit change is habit itself. So we have to go back and look at what's going on with these 33,000 decisions a day. So this, if you look it up, humans make about 33,000 decisions a day. And those decisions, if you consider 95% of everything we do is done by habit, those decisions are actually the majority of stimulus response cycles. So let's say we're making 31,500 stimulus response cycles a day. 65,000 seconds a day, you're basically doing a new stimulus response cycle every other second. And the way I have this set up, so you have the pre-stimulus, we don't know what's coming. Then we get a stimulus, right? And we react. And then from that reaction, we respond. And sometimes people make the response and the reaction the same, which is not a good thing. And then after that response, if we don't do anything, we've already primed ourselves for the next conditioned reaction. The point here is that we have to prime ourselves, get back to homeostasis, get back to mindfulness, get back to the present moment. So when the next stimulus happens, we have a reaction and we have a pause before the response, and it's aligned with our design. That's the point about doing the laps and using the 7-step reset. So the 7-step reset is used at the micro level. Each little tiny habit, we use the 7-step reset, and we use the 7-step reset at the macro level, for example, changing our life design. Or I should say pursuing our transforming for our life design. And then we have the 7-step reset. Now, if you took this screenshot yesterday or before, it's different now. I've updated it because the other one was more like written like a transition, like it was kind of mixed. So here's what we want, then here's what's happening, and here's what we used to do. Now it's all about the future. So this is all about how we want it because I'm walking through them in a little more detail now. And we're over here, the first step. So this is the pre-stimulus. This is our state. This is how we're behaving during the day. And everyone has experienced having something good happen at the beginning of the day, and it sort of colors and helps your day move along in a nice positive way. The same way if something bad happens, especially if you're going to a big meeting or something. I remember getting a ticket before going to a meeting, and then you're distracted for the rest of the day and stuff like that. You get a flat tire, you're late. These things can have the effect of throwing you off course. We have to have ourselves in such a way that not only are we able to be strong on a good day of a good week, we have to be strong on a bad day of a good week, and we have to be strong on a bad day of a bad week. And typically on a bad day of a bad week, it's more about recovering. So that's where step 2 comes in. Step 2 is the check-in to see how we're doing. We need to keep getting back here. I don't care what happens. You owe it to your future self to get back to a growth mindset quickly. And I'm talking about in seconds, not minutes. And we can do that. There's ways to do it. Everything here has levers. Every single one of these steps has multiple levers, which I'm covering now. That's why we're talking about neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is probably the largest lever initially because the biggest obstacle to habit change is habit itself. So the first habit we have to overcome is the habit of staying ourselves, the habit of resisting transformation. Once that habit is resolved or replaced with a habit that's more conducive to transformation, the rest of it becomes easy. But I could spend 45 days here just working through getting that new habit in place. But once it's done, you can get back to a growth mindset quickly. You'll spot it yourself, etc. I can go on and on, but I'll talk more about that in step 2. So step 1 is our development. This is who we are, and we're going to keep upgrading that so our good days become better and our bad weeks become better, and our ability to manage in a bad day of a bad week is better. And then the step 2 is checking in to see where we are and adjusting if needed, because you know another stimulus is coming and you want to be at the right frame of mind to do that. And then steps 4, there's a pause here that and by the way, this is all conditioned in. Everything that happens at step 3 and on to step 4 is conditioned in because it's happening so fast. The network of neurons, aka subconscious, where this is happening, processes at 11 million bits per second, has a reaction time of about a quarter of a second. Our conscious mind, where step 4 is happening, processes at 50 bits per second. That's compared to 11 million bits, way outgunned. And then the reaction time is a half a second. So we have a gap here. Rather than just letting that gap be filled with whatever the network of neurons, aka subconscious, throwing at us, which is fear-based typically, and just creating more and more and more fight or flight, that pause is actually used for us to pull from the subconscious, because the conscious mind is over the subconscious. Sub is below, right? So the conscious mind can dictate what we want from that, but you have to condition it, and you can't tell it because it's processing too fast, and it gets to see the information before the conscious mind does. But you can condition it so that it hands that off to you. We'll talk more about that when we get there. But this, instead of it handing off to you just raw data, it's handing off to you the first step of problem solving, which is clearly define the problem. In step 4, we also do a quick check-in, sort of like here, to see where we are emotionally. If we're emotionally charged, we're going to do an emotional modulation step. And this takes 0 to 90 seconds. Typically, this 7-step process is only going to will be less than a second. It's really 6 steps, because your step 1 is just your ongoing state of being, your status quo for the day, but it is part of it. So these steps, it'll be at less than a second, but if you need to do an emotional modulation, then it could be up to another 90 seconds just to get that settled, so you're not acting out of being triggered. This is where people need the ability, when you see these videos of people being triggered and it just scales up so quickly, road rage or whatever, this is where they need to be able to learn emotional modulation. And that's the step. That's an important step, because if you do this, you have a much better chance of priming yourself back for a good next stimulus response cycle. And 6 is action, 7 is return to mindfulness. Now today, what I'll talk about today is leaning into more of the what happens with neuroplasticity. Yesterday was explaining neuroplasticity. I'll touch on it again at the right time today, because I want to set the stage. But the first thing we want to do is look at what's going on and why habits are so difficult to change. Now, before I go forward, if I'm talking to somebody about neuroplasticity, it's very common for me to see their eyes glass over. Or what'll happen is they'll start connecting it to something else. Oh yeah, that sounds like this. Oh yeah, that's the amygdala, right there. But they're just like, it's associations. They're just like trying to be right. You know, it's like, and I don't mean that in a negative way at all, but we're conditioned to want to understand things. We're conditioned to make the unfamiliar familiar as quickly as possible. So we're like, oh, that's like this, that's like that. And that cuts off the learning. What we have to do is stay open to it. If I talk to somebody about muscle memory, that doesn't happen. Most people have experienced muscle memory, and if they haven't, they have a working knowledge of it. They've heard the term enough. Point is, if I describe neuroplasticity but never call it neuroplasticity, I just call it muscle memory, I don't lose anybody. They're there. Then I make the point that muscle memory is not muscle memory, it's actually nervous system memory. Then you start to lose people, because it's like, wait a minute, it doesn't even make sense. Well, think about it. The muscles don't have memory. It's the nervous system that activates the muscle, and the muscle does its thing. So muscle memory is really nervous system memory. The second part that we're going to talk about is people will often look at this idea of the brain parts because we've many in the industry, if you look at people who are into emotional intelligence and all that, they start talking about what parts of the brain does this and what parts of the brain does that. And that's because when emotional intelligence did most of its movement, we didn't have the access to the brain scanning tools that we do today. So we went from the philosophers in the New Thought era and before, from 1850 to about 1940, and all those books were written. The philosophers were sharing information, and the advent of the printing press, that's what created that New Thought era. So much information was published, and it was called a subconscious. Then we get access to the printing press, to the scanning tools, and we recognize that, oh, wait a minute, it's not a subconscious mind, it's this network of neurons. And emotional intelligence was coming on board around that time, in my opinion. And so, emotional intelligence, instead of calling it a subconscious, it started talking about what parts of the brain things are working in. Well, the challenge is that when you go down that path, it's like trying to figure out how a car works when all you really need to do is drive it. You don't need to understand throttle bodies and intake manifolds and exhaust manifolds and all that. You just need to push the button, put it in gear, and drive, unless you want to build cars. So that's how we want to look at this habit change and transformation and crushing anxiety, is just driving the car. So the pushback I have with looking at it from, oh, that's the basal ganglia, that's the hippocampus, or that's the amygdala, is that those are all neurons. They're all groups, like neighborhoods of neurons. And those groups of neurons, yes, they have a specific function, but neurons all behave in a similar way. So we have 100 billion neurons, 20 billion of them are in the prefrontal cortex, which was formed from age 19 to 27 about, which is why our 20s are so much different than our 30s, because we have an abundance of neurotransmitter, which is necessary as those neurons are being formed. We don't have to talk about it as the basal ganglia or the hippocampus, because it's all neurons and they all behave the same way. That's why we stay up at the neuroplasticity level. So that's a big difference, I think, that when I talk about it versus emotional intelligence folks talk about it. It aligns with emotional intelligence. It aligns with how we talked about the subconscious before that. But looking at it from a neuroplasticity standpoint, you recognize that that cognitive processing is physiological and neurobiological. It's not mental. It's not the mind. The mind is separate. The mind is conscious, as I said, processes at 50 bits per second, whereas the network of neurons processes at 11 million bits per second, because there's energy that's going through that network of neurons. There's 100 billion neurons. Each neuron is connected to 1,000 to 10,000 other neurons, maybe more. So that's trillions of connections. Imagine, how do you get your arms wrapped around that? So that's why we have steps in a process, and that's why I talk about conditioning things in. We want to condition it in so the automaticity is working for our life design rather than not. And at this point, I like to talk about bring up the hunter-gatherer. So if we've been the human race has been hunter-gatherer for most of the 10,000 years, right? It's just the last few hundred years that we've had cars and in industry and technology, etc. But we also see where people are saying the brain, researchers are telling us the brain is 200,000 years old. So there's a lot of evolution packed into tens of thousands of years, or at least thousands of years, and the small amount of time from like the last 500 years or so is very, very small compared to the big part. And this is why we have to reset. That's why I call it a reset, because the way the conditioning was set up, it was based on the hunter-gatherer. And that's why we have most of our learning occurs from 0 to 7, most of our conditioning. 0 to 7, from 0 to 2, kids are in the theta state, then they move into the alpha state. They don't have to work for it. They just learn. It's like automatic. They just show up and they learn. Same thing happens in our teens, but now we're adding the personality, but the majority of the conditioning is 0 to 7. It made sense in a hunter-gatherer period because how they hunt and gather at age 35 is probably the same as they hunted and gathered at age 5. So it doesn't change. But if you look at today, as a boomer, what I learned is 0 to 7. There were no computers in the homes, right? There were, in fact, well, you just go on down that path. No anti-lock brakes, no seat belts. There's just on and on. The differences between 0 to 7 versus today. So now, when you look at nervous system memory, not muscle memory, and then you look at the nervous system was conditioned from 0 to 7. Why is that? Because there's an abundance of myelin and neurotransmitter from 0 to 7, and then from 8 to 27, there's an abundance. And in the 20s, we have an abundance of neurotransmitter and myelin because it's setting the model of the world based on that conditioning. So it's sort of like the prefrontal cortex locks in the learning. Myelin, I'll come back to myelin. So what we're talking about here, as I mentioned, that everything is fractal, and the micro is had some interesting situations today with technology. Let me just, okay, there we go. Now, what we're talking about, we're just going along here. This is our life, and we decide that we want to change. We decide that we're not comfortable here. We're going to be ambitious, and we want this. We want to do this. That's that inflection point, and then we're on a trajectory. Life here is very different than life here. Now, first of all, it's not just as simple as breaking out. There is a bit of a barrier here that creates some cognitive dissonance. That cognitive dissonance is created because we have to break through beliefs, stories, and those things. But here's what I want to focus on with this diagram. We decide we want to do this. Here is governed by habit, right? 95% of everything we do is by habit. Up here, you don't have the habit. What we're going to do is govern it by principles. So this is a shift. And this is what comes up with transformation. This is why transformation is difficult. It always fascinated me how many times you read somebody who's successful, you read about someone who's successful, and there was a point in time when they lost everything. Sleeping on their parents' sofa, being homeless. There was a point in time when they lost everything. Now you could say, one person could start believing that, gee, I have to lose everything before I can have what I really want. I would say no. What happens is when they lose everything, all their stories, all their beliefs, all their I don't want power, all their resistance, all the things holding them on first base get destroyed. And when that gets destroyed, there's no more cognitive dissonance. It's now survival. So transformation and survival now line up. And the difference between here and here is that here we get to live by habit. 95% is by habit. And up here, you don't have the habits to rely on, so you use principles. The other thing I want to point out on this page is that there's a thing called homeostasis, which is the brain and central nervous system trying to make everything efficient. They want to stabilize, versus allostasis. So think about homeostasis, stabilizing the status quo the way it's always been, and allostasis, stabilizing the trajectory. And if the best example I can use that you can look up readily, if you, whatever social media platform you're on, just look up through hikers, through THROUGH or THRU, hiker, or hiking, through hiking. And look at some of the creators who are documenting their hike. One of the things, so a through hike, an example of a through hike is the Pacific Crest Trail. There's a lot of people who have it on their goal list, their bucket list, to hike from Mexico to Canada or Canada to Mexico, right, through California, Oregon, and Washington. What you'll notice with these through hikers is when they start, they're doing 10 to 15 mile days. A lot of them, when they finish, they're doing 30-mile days. That's the allostasis in action, the example of it. We don't have to get into how the car is built, but the short version is that the brain and central nervous system are constantly predicting how much demand is coming. And when the prediction matches the demand, it cuts back on making neurotransmitter because neurotransmitter is expensive from an energy standpoint. When it comes up short, and it's over a couple of days, it's the prediction is short, it starts to flood the system with neurotransmitter because neurotransmitter is not just the dopamine and serotonin, serotonin being the mood enhancer, dopamine being the habit formation aid. It's also, dopamine is also a signal amplifier. So the more dopamine you have, the stronger your signal is. So there is a separation between, or difference between the neural pathway, that's this where the signal is coming from, the impulse, and the muscle. So there's a muscle junction in there, and that muscle junction is even neurotransmitter. It's called acetylcholine. And there's also sort of a junction, it's not really a junction, but there's a connection between the central nervous system and the neural pathway, and that's called glutamate. These are all neurotransmitters. So the more neurotransmitters I have, the stronger my signal can be, and the stronger my signal is, the more I can activate the muscle. So that's the homeostasis versus allostasis. Homeostasis wants status quo the way it's always been. And you, if you're in an organization, you've recognized this, the amount of pressure and tension to let's do it the way we've always done it. I remember being in an organization, and anytime there was something new to do, somebody would pull out the old PowerPoint presentation and essentially recreate the past with different words. It's bizarre now looking back at it through this lens. But here's what's interesting. When you are here and you're moving up this line, when you are going up, there is a lot of resistance because unfamiliar is a threat. The reason why you have the habits you have is because they were formed for your safety. And when you're doing this, first of all, any breakthrough requires a break with the past. Any breakthrough is preceded by some confusion because you're letting go, you're breaking through stories. That's the cognitive dissonance. But as you're going up, the resistance gets intense, and it's trying to stop you and keep you from going up. But what's interesting is when you fully break through, the same energy that was resisting to keep you alive turns into like empowerment catalyst. Because the objective was never to stop you, the objective was to keep you alive, but it thought what it was doing was keeping you alive. This is why it's so hard to leave first base when you want to go to second, proverbially speaking. This is why, in my opinion, when a person loses everything, they've already wiped this out. They've already broken through it. This is what happened, in my opinion, in Ranger School. Going through Ranger training, they literally break this. All this resistance, you just pound it every day, and it just breaks away. It's like you wear it out. I had a broken wrist. My hand was up here on the wrist, and what they had to do was, now think about it. I was at the time, I was deadlifting like 400 pounds. And there's nothing connecting the wrist to the bone other than tendons, ligaments, right? Tendons, ligaments, muscles, etc. So I'm lifting 400 pounds in a deadlift, pulling that bar up. So when my wrist broke, the hand got snatched up here. And what they did was they put these tubes on my fingers and had weights on them. And they just left it there for a couple of hours. And it literally fatigued the muscles, it fatigued everything, and then they could move my hand back into place and on and on. It's a visual of what happened in Ranger School, whereas they just beat on this thing over and over and over until it fails, and then you're free to build. So what I'm talking about with the 7-step reset is to do all of that without having to lose everything, without having to spend 8 weeks with people yelling at you in your face and making you wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and crawling through mud, etc. You can do it by understanding and applying neuroplasticity. So that's the homeostasis and allostasis. Now, when this is what I talked about yesterday, and to the refresher is that, so you have neurons, there's 100 billion of them, and a neural pathway, the amount of neural pathways that can be involved in making a step is literally thousands, right? If there's trillions of neuron connections, you can imagine how many neural pathways are needed just to take a step, let alone do something complex. And a neural pathway is made up of neurons and then neurotransmitters, synapses in between. Synaptogenesis is the process of the neurotransmitter sort of being pruned away from unused neural pathways to be put into neural pathways that are active. This is that feeling at the beginning of the season when you feel a little awkward, but it only lasts a day or two, and then by the third day you're back on track. The neurotransmitter was either created, produced to fill in those neural pathways, or another neural pathway was pruned. So if you have seasonal sports, you can imagine the synapses moves from one set of neural pathways over to the other ones. It's the way the body operates. Again, it makes sense when you look at it from a hunter-gatherer standpoint. With allostasis, what we're doing is creating more synapses, more neurotransmitter, and then these purple lines are depicting myelin. So this is not how a neural pathway looks. You can look it up. It's completely different there, but it makes it easier to explain. So here we have a myelinated neuron, and when neurons get wrapped with myelin, and you do that with deep practice, or I should say 3 ways to get a neuron wrapped with myelin: intensity, duration, or frequency. Ideally all 3, and that's what deep practice does. Deep practice brings in intensity, it brings in frequency, and it does duration, not in terms of pure duration, but with intense focus. So if a person doing deep practice using working on a piano piece, they may get exhausted after 5 minutes of deep practice, whereas they could practice regularly for an hour. Now, when you wrap the neurons with myelin, they fire faster, stronger, and with more accuracy. So if you think about a person shooting 3-point shots and has a high percentage, they have well-wrapped neurons. If they stop playing basketball, the neurons will continue to be wrapped, but the neurotransmitter leaves. That's the synaptogenesis. It gets pruned onto something else. And if they went out and tried to hit some three-pointers, they're going to miss much more than they would have when they were practicing. But with just a few days of practice, it comes back because the neurons are there. So the neurons fire fast, strong, more accurately, but you need the connection of the neurotransmitter connecting them. And that's the neurotransmitter is what's so fluid. That's the allostasis and the homeostasis. I don't want to shortchange the myelination because that's a big factor. And myelination is part of neuroplasticity, but you need both. And you're not going to get myelination without the synaptogenesis happening. But once you get it happening, then it's like riding a bicycle. That's what they talk about. It's just like riding a bicycle. So they get wrapped with myelin, and now because of the allostasis, you get more neurotransmitter. This is the through hiker doing 30-mile days at the end of the through hike versus 15-mile days were hard and long, considered long at the beginning. So this is a strong pathway. This is why it's easier to replace habits than it is to break a habit. This is very difficult to break. And it's more difficult because as you try to break it, what are you triggering? You're triggering associations. What are those associations? Those associations are there reinforcing the old habit. By layering on a new habit that doesn't trigger these associations, it triggers other ones, it gives you a chance to build up the neural pathway to the point where you now have a new neural pathway. You're not going to break the neurons down, but the synapse moves to this other one. This is why sometimes it's easy, you break a habit or replace a habit, it's easy to slip back. But by understanding that this is the process, you just get back on the horse and go after it again. You just reinforce and lean into the new habit is the solution. You just keep reinforcing the new habit. And that's why I use a 90-day transformation with the 7 fitness, the 7 performance areas, and the 7-step reset. I'm constantly monitoring where's the person, where are they improving. So I'm looking for improvement in that mental, physical, spiritual, emotional. I'm looking for week to week, month to month improvement. And when it stalls, we have to look at why that's stalling and go back and backtrack and then use the 7-step reset to keep the momentum going. I mentioned hiking. Other things that will show up here, I've seen people with painting. It works with painting. It's not just strong physical things, because the what makes it work is there's 7 factors that are associated with this. Novelty, so something new. Intention, you have to be very intentional about what you're doing. So if you're painting, trying to paint a landscape, it's very intentional. You're focused. You get into that flow state. These 7 factors are very consistent with flow state. Then you have balance or complexity. I say balance or complexity. If it's physical, obviously balance makes a sense. Like if you think about hiking and you're scrambling over rocks, etc., there's some balance. But if you're painting, you don't balance unless you're introducing that, but you do have complexity because you have the branches and the leaves, etc. Then we have precision. That makes sense. So you want to be precise with it. And by the way, neurons, when they fire accurately, that's considered 0 plus or minus 4 milliseconds. That's plus or minus 4 thousandths of a second. There's 8 thousandths of a, not even a hundredth of a second range between that. And so the more precise you are, the closer you're going to be to all the neurons in a pathway firing it right at 0, not plus or minus. So that was precision. And then progression. We want to keep increasing it. And the through hikers don't get from 15 to 30 just by, it doesn't just happen. They're pushing it. They're going, 15, then they're doing a few 17-mile days. Then they're doing a few 19-mile days. Then a few 22-mile days. And a lot of the through hikers, they set these goals and they have to be at the post office to pick up their things by this time. They have a camp reservation by that time. And so there's this pressure, and it makes it important. So that's the progression. And then you have explosiveness on the physical, or intensity bursts on actions, and that's the intensity would be, if you think about hiking, the intensity comes in, the energy burst comes in because you got a day or two where you've got to get some distance done to get to your campsite before the permit expires. And then the last one is struggle at the edge of ability. So when you look up deep practice, you'll mostly see struggle at the edge of ability, but those other 7 factors are all associated with neurotransmitter production. And whether you're sprinting or footwork drills or hiking or knitting, I put down painting, pottery, rock wall climbing is another good one. Musical instruments is another good one. When you're doing those, you're building neurotransmitter. Neurotransmitter is not the neurotransmitter. The same factors that are present with neurotransmitter production and increase are present that improve mitochondria. Mitochondria is like the organs in our cells. The BDNF, brain-derived neurotropic factor, which is essentially the health of the neurons and the cells. So that BDNF is actually helping your neurons better, which is going to help you with the neuroplasticity. It builds testosterone for men and estrogen for women after menopause. This is all the things that are associated with the same things that produce more neurotransmitter. Anti-inflammation, reduces oxidative waste. The list is long. Look up benefits for sprinting and you'll see that list, and that list works for these other things that I'm talking about when you apply those 7 factors: novelty, precision, balance or complexity, progression, and then explosiveness or energy bursts, and struggle at the edge of ability. It's going to be present there. And I use footwork drills, I use walking with a weighted vest, I use hiking, and I like to hike and put time limits on myself because I live in a flat area, so I don't have the hills. I have to drive to get to the hills. But when I'm just doing some hiking for recreation or neurotransmitter production, I put goals on myself, like whether it's the pace, the average pace, or setting myself to get to a certain place by a certain time and putting that pressure on, and that keeps the intensity. What we're doing with the intensity, those 7 factors are communicating to the nervous system and the brain that this is an important thing, and that's where the allostasis kicks in. Just checking my notes, make sure I covered everything I want. And I'll wrap up with this, and I'll start here tomorrow. This works better when you have a purpose, when you have meaning, when you have a goal that's bigger than yourself. So if I'm working with somebody or someone who wants to work with me, we'll talk about their plan. If their plan is something that's well within their reach, I wait for them to come up with something bigger. And if you are doing this yourself, you can ask yourself, what does this look like if I 10x it? Now, the first thing you'll do is probably say, I can't 10x it. It's impossible. Can't 10x. Yeah, but what if you could 10x it? If a person, because there are examples out there where somebody 10x'd it, probably. If you could 10x it, what does that look like? And then what would have to happen? And what you'll find is that there's a lot of things that this person is uncomfortable with between them and the ability to do 10x. There's just a lot of things they've never done before, which is why they don't have the associations to support it. This gets back to this kind of image where you have you want to do this, but you have the resistance pushing you back down. I actually drew it better on this one. You have the resistance pushing you back down, and then you have to break through. And once you accept that 10x is possible and I'm going to do it, and you recognize that you're going to need other people to help you, then we get into the 7 performance areas and we work through that. So it makes sense to have something bigger than yourself. It doesn't have to be purpose. It could be a proxy for purpose, but I like to have something that's big enough and important enough that you're willing to crawl over broken glass. You're not going to have to crawl over broken glass, but to take the steps, you have to have the kind of energy and desire that it takes to walk over broken glass. The other thing I'll talk about tomorrow is how we have to not start the next thing the way you've always done it. You have to start the next thing with the end in mind. This is one of the habits in 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. You can look up Merlin method, Merlin, Merlin method, but it's the way I do it is I draw the box at the end. Let's do it right here, and then we'll close with that. So instead of doing, I'm making like a process flow. Instead of what do I do next? What's my step? Where I go? We're going to do this. What's my outcome? And then from the outcome, we figure out what has to happen for that to occur. And then we do the same thing here and here. And then we have our first step. So this is something else that we do. We don't just start with purpose. We start with purpose and then back into what we do today. If you don't do that, what you'll find is that you will tend to do what you've always done. If you ask the question, what should we do first? The answer is almost always what you've always done, some variation of that. If you ever watch someone who's habitually late all the time, you'll watch that they do the same thing each time. And if you can just get them to, wait, let's work backwards. What time do we want to be there this time? Okay, what has to happen for us to get there? We have to leave by then. What has to happen for us to leave by then? We have to blah, blah, blah. And then you get back here and you recognize, oh, I have to start a half hour earlier than I've been starting. But because they've always done it the same way, they've never changed that. They just try harder. It's a simple example, but that's why we start there. So we start with purpose and we start with the outcome, and then we work backwards and come up with our first step. And then the neuroplasticity, we have context for neuroplasticity. We have context for deep practice. We have context to create the allostasis. And we'll talk about this tomorrow, and I'll bridge it into why neuroplasticity and priming are intertwined. But I would say focus on the neuroplasticity because it's the habits, right? And the biggest obstacle to habit change is habit itself. Let's see. Now, this was, again, I got a little off track talking about transformation, but remember, anxiety follows the similar path. As a matter of fact, excitement and anxiety have the same signature. It's both energy running through the neurons. We'll get into emotional later at step 5, but I know emotional intelligence talks a lot about emotion. I don't want to bring that into play here because in step 2, what we're going to do is make sure we're at a good state of being, mental, physical, spiritual, and emotional state of being, and that our self-image is in check. And the self-image is going to be in check because we're going to build habits around it. So we don't have the negative self-talk, not because we've stopped ourselves from doing it, but because we've created different associations, so the habits are different, and the other habits die. But tomorrow I'll finish up neuroplasticity. Friday I'll do priming, and then on Monday we'll get into the mindset, and I think I'll spend 2 or 3 days on physiology because it is so important. You can look up Amy Cutter on YouTube. She has a YouTube video just like it sounds, Cutter. She talks about how posture can create testosterone, and what she's leaning into is these associations, and she's leaning into this allostasis in a different kind of way. And you'll find, if you look hard enough, that there are people who say it doesn't work. Well, what I would argue is that, first of all, you can get research to say anything you want these days. It's a shame that it's gotten to that point. But I can explain it through the lens of neuroplasticity and why it does work, but also what's going on when it doesn't work. And that's one of the ways that you can understand neuroplasticity. When you understand what goes wrong when it doesn't work, it gives you a way to understand what's going on with the manifestation crowd or the law of attraction crowd, and you'll be able to see that entire spectrum of law of attraction through the lens of the network of neurons. You may not get there tomorrow, but once you start seeing the world through the network of neurons and you lean into and experience neuroplasticity, then it starts to happen. All right, so that is it. We'll see you tomorrow, 8 o'clock Pacific Standard Time. The recordings will be out on the platforms for a few days. And you can also get more information at 7stepreset.com. That's where I put the some of the older videos, but certainly today's will be there through tomorrow. Then tomorrow's will replace it. All right, we'll see you next time.